So now that we have delineated the watershed and broken it into subbasins, our next step is to define what are known as HRUs, or hydrologic response units. And this is what ArcSwat uses to model the entire watershed. An HRU is an area that has similar slope, land use, and soil. And so it's an area, a small area that's expected to behave about the same way to a precipitation event, is the way to think about this. So within each subbasin, you're going to have several different HRUs. So you might have a field, and it all has the same land use, and it all has the same soil type. But parts of the field might have a different slope. And so the flatter part is going to respond differently to rain than the steeper part. That's the thing to think about. Or you might have a place that has the same soil type but different land uses within it, and so it's going to behave differently. So defining the HRUs is critical to getting the SWAT model to run properly. So that's what we're going to do now. The first step in delineating the HRU is to tell ArcSwat where to find information on land use and soil and slope. Slope it'll get from the DEM you've already loaded in, but you're going to need to define what you consider a critical slope. We'll do that later. The first step is to define land use. So if we click on this, then we see the screen that comes up has tabs for land use, soil, and slope. So we'll start with land use first. And it's asking for a land use grid. So basically it wants the raster we have of land use. Okay? And I've already created a land use raster. So I'm going to load it in. And I'm going to load it from the disk. I haven't put it in my map yet. And it warns me that the grid should be projected. And it is. That's one of the things you have to do before you start. Make sure everything is projected. I always use UTMs. It's much easier. So I've already projected my land use raster. And here I've named it SL land use UTM. And it looks like it loaded in successfully. You've got percent of overlap and everything. At any rate, you get a happy message here, so that's good. So it's loaded in. So if you look at our map now, you'll see that it has loaded in the land use area and it has clipped it for our watershed. So the actual raster I'm using is much bigger, but we don't care about anything outside the watershed. And you can see that it's colored it automatically for different land uses. So let's go to choose grid field to tell ArcSwat which of the fields in the attribute table define land use. And this particular raster, since I've already clipped it and reprojected it, it only has two fields, value and count. So value is a number that corresponds to a land use, and count is just how many cells have that value. So value is our grid field. So now let's hit OK, and you see that it has filled in this table with all the different values that it finds. So in our land use raster, each of these numbers corresponds to a different land use. Well, let's look at where I got this land use from. Now there's different places, but I get this one from the Illinois Data Clearinghouse. This is the USDA-NASS cropland data from 2007. And like I said, I think I know that there are several different types of land use rasters out there, but this one seems to be very appropriate for our purposes. So I've downloaded it. You can get it for the whole state. I've clipped it down for our area. ArcSwat's clipped it down even further for our watershed. I've reprojected it. I'm not going to show you any of that stuff. But here we've got the metadata. If we scroll down, here are the definitions for each of those categories. So number 1 is corn, number 2 is cotton. And you see that it's broken them down into row crops, grains, hay and seeds, other crops, open non-crop, open non-crop. There's a difference between these. These are fruit trees and that, and these are grasslands. Other, you see water and wetlands. As an aquatic ecologist, I'm concerned that wetlands is just thrown into other. I think wetlands should have its own category, but let's not nitpick. And then you see we have some different NLCD derived non-crop, and you've got perennial ice, developed open space, deciduous forest. So basically for each cell in that raster, it gets a code corresponding to what the land use is for that particular cell. So that's great. That's good information. Let's go back to ArcMap. And we see that we've got a few of these values here, and it's already determined the percent of area for each of those. So if you look at value 1 is the most common. If we come back here, you'll see that value 1 is corn, and that makes sense. You know that most of the watershed in Spring Lake is corn. The next most common is 5. Let's go back here just for fun. 5 is going to be soybeans. That's what I figured. So you see that the corn and soybeans make up a huge portion of the Spring Lake watershed. Okay, so that's great, but ArcSwat can't work with these values. It has no idea what these values mean, okay? And ArcSwat has some very specific land uses and very kind of broad land uses, like agriculture. At least for this first model we're running, we're not going to break down the difference between corn and soybeans. We just know we went the difference between, say, agriculture and forest. I think we can get more precise later on, but for right now, that's what we're going to go with. So we need to reclassify this raster and use ArcSwat's categories. Now, I could potentially do each of these individually, but that seems like a pain. I've already done that. I've already figured out the different codes here, and I've put them in a lookup table. And this is the easiest way to do this, is to have a lookup table, and that way you don't have to reclassify by hand every time. So I'm going to load in my lookup table, but let me show it to you first. I saved mine as a simple text file, and this is basically you've got the headings in quotes here, and then for each code you have a comma and then what ArcSwat land use category corresponds to that code. So you see that 1 was corn, we're going to reclassify that as agriculture. 5 was soybeans, we're going to reclassify that as agriculture, and so on and so on. And then we've also got water, urban, pasture, forested, pasture. So I had to go back here. When I made this lookup table, I had to make some judgment calls. So for example, if I go to my lookup table, I said 171, I'm going to classify as pasture. 171 is grassland, herbaceous, and you see that incorporates all these different types, which includes pasture. So anything coded 171, it's safe to call it a pasture in our model. And like 121, I classified as urban. That's developed open space. If it's developed, that probably in our watershed, there's not really a lot of urban. That probably means a road. It might mean some of the, you've got developed high intensity here, 124, which we've also classified as urban. That might be where people have built houses or the subdivisions that are out there. So you have to kind of make some judgment calls, but I think it's fairly easy to develop this lookup table to reclassify your raster. Now you'll note that I only have a few values in my lookup table, and there are a lot more here in the metadata. And that's because these are the only land use categories that are showing up in the Spring Lake watershed. Down the road, it would probably make sense to expand this table to include all the codes, so then you never have to worry about redefining for other watersheds. We're not going to mess with that now. So this is the text file that I've already saved. So if I come back here and click on Lookup Table. There are some predefined ones if you have some other land use rasters. But since I'm using my own table, I'm just going to click User Table. And I'm going to search for it, and here it is right here. That's the text file that I just showed you. When I hit Select, you'll see that it reclassified all the different values into these 5 different land use categories that ArcSwat is going to use. And so it shrunk several of the other values here, which is not a problem. So we lost, like soybeans and that. But you see that it combined all the agricultures into one cell code, all the water into another urban pasture. So you can see the basic percentage breakdown of these different land use types. Again, this is an area where you could probably expand and play with more. You can certainly change the land use from, say, agriculture to pasture or agriculture to forested and see how that affects things. But I think you can probably get more detailed down the road. We're not going to mess with that. But at any rate, now ArcSwat knows how to classify all the different cells in our land use raster. So let's hit Reclassify to make it official. And it is now official. And we hit OK. And you notice that it has reclassified the land use to represent agriculture. The light blue is pasture. The orange is forested. Urban, you don't see a lot of urban except the roads. And so you can see that the roads are classified as urban. And here, up here, I think that's probably Scioto, is classified as urban. And then also there's a little bit that's classified as water, where there were a couple of small ponds, I would assume. So that's it. Now ArcSwat is ready to play with your land use raster.